Brexit. Most people have an opinion, and lots of us have questions. So this week on the Property Podcast, Rob and I wanted to help out. We're going to answer your top 10 Brexit questions.
Yes, welcome to the Property Podcast, where every Thursday morning property investors come together to be informed and inspired. And after doing a sterling job of avoiding talking about Brexit for the most part for the last couple of years, we're now talking about it for the third week in a row. But we have to, because things are coming to a head. People are worried about what might happen, and people want to know how to take advantage of what's happening. So we're going to be covering all of that in today's episode.
So this week's news story, Rob, is really interesting because on last week's podcast, we covered quite a few news stories and many of them were negative. So a really, really positive news story this week with some unbelievable numbers attached. And of course, this was covered by all the press and everyone is now talking about it. Or are they?
Yeah, so we found this one in The Guardian. This is reporting on the Halifax House Price Index. And the headline is, UK house prices make surprise 5.9% rise in February. That's the biggest monthly increase since 1983. And it's added more than £13,000 to the value of a typical home in just a month. This is absolutely remarkable. Is the scale of the increase what they say it is? Well, we'll come back to that. But the interesting thing, Rob, is that despite this being the exact opposite of everything that we've read recently, this story hasn't really been picked up in that many places.
If we take this story at face value and those numbers are correct, then this is phenomenal. Like, outrageous growth. But yet, the papers don't seem to want to have a big splash on a positive news piece right now. And this is the point. It's not to say that, this news story proves that all the negative ones are wrong, but it's more to highlight how the media is fed to us and how it can quite easily start to make people believe a certain truth is the truth that may not be the truth. So I think it's really important for balance that we bring you this news story. But Rob, I think it's fair that we look a little deeper into this headline, because while we have and quite regularly pick apart negative headlines, particularly when we get into the depth of any story and you find out the headline is quite misleading, it could be the same here.
Yeah, it could be. There's no manipulation in the actual headline. They're just reporting the 5.9% monthly change from the Halifax Index. But there is some skepticism about whether this figure can actually be correct, because it's an absolutely enormous jump. It would be notable at any time, but especially now when things have been static for such a long time. It seems odd. Now, the Halifax Index is biased towards the north, and the north is where the growth is at the moment. So that does go some way to explaining why it's more optimistic than some of the other indexes that we've seen. But still surprising. I personally am dubious about the scale of the increase. And I think one of the reasons why we might have seen this is that the number of transactions is so low at the moment. So we've reported in previous weeks about how transaction volumes are down in the last 3 months, and they're even down over the last year's figures, which themselves were way down on the previous year. So when you don't have that many transactions to work with, there's always going to be more volatility in the index of what it is that you're measuring. So I think that's probably the cause of this. And actually, when you go into the original Halifax report, there's an unbelievable graph in there showing how the number of properties that are being marketed for sale has fallen off over the last 10 years or so. And obviously that number cratered after the financial crash. It then stayed reasonably steady for years, but then leading up to the EU referendum and ever since then, it's just gone down and down and down. So it's a really striking illustration of the uncertainty and the effect that that has had. So I imagine that's why we're seeing this huge jump, but it's so big that I'd say it's probably going to be directionally right, even if the number itself is a little bit out.
So over the past couple of weeks, we've been talking Brexit. Pretty much the whole country's been talking Brexit for the last few years, so forgive us for the last few weeks. But it's been an interesting few episodes. First of all, we heard from hubbers who are active in the property world, and the great thing is they're not letting Brexit get in the way of their plans and their financial goals. And then last week, we gave you our thoughts, and opinionated they were. But last week, we wanted to understand what was left. What haven't we answered yet? What would you like our opinion on? And you were very generous and you have helped us out.
Yep, your questions have flooded in. You've sent them by email, you've posted them on the forum, you've sent them in on social media, had lots of direct messages, and we've compiled those together into the 10 most frequent questions that we've received. And right now, we're going to answer them. So let's kick off then with question number 1.
Will Brexit make the market crash?
No. Next question. No, let's do a bit better than that. No, the market won't crash. Now, last week we talked about the different outcomes that we could have from Brexit. But if we look at what is considered to be the most economically damaging in the short term, and I emphasise the short term, a no-deal Brexit, then would we have a crash? Well, the answer is still no. We may have a dip, and I'd say a dip in property prices is likely. A correction, possibly. But a full-on crash? No. And Rob, there's a few reasons for that.
Yeah, and the main reason for that we covered when we were talking about our news story. The fact that transactions have dropped off so much because everybody's waiting to see what happens. Nobody's buying or selling unless they have to. And I think we're now at a point where just having the whole thing being over with would be seen as a good result. Everyone's, I think, pretty much prepared for any kind of flavour of anything. Therefore, just having it done and knowing what happens next will see those transaction volumes come back and prices come back. Now, there are variations there. If the outcome is seen as unexpectedly positive, then there could be a real boost to prices because there's going to be optimism there. If it's seen as the worst end of the range, then there's going to be a short-term sentiment shock, maybe people sitting out for even longer to see how things play out, but ultimately it's going to come back again. For there to actually be a crash, one of two things needs to happen. It either needs to be dramatically worse than anyone expects, which weighs on sentiment, and that seems virtually impossible. Or the government or the Bank of England will need to take economic action to overcome the consequences of whatever happens that ends up hitting the housing market. The most likely mechanism for a housing crash would be a spike in interest rates, but it's very hard to see why under any scenario they would feel the need to do that or think that that would be desirable. So will there be a crash? I'm fairly confident in saying no. But if that doesn't happen, what will happen to prices?
Will prices go up or down?
Great question. So, it depends, really. In the short term, and when I say short term, I mean the first 3 months, it's a little hard to say. If we get what is seen as a positive outcome, then prices will probably start to rise. If, as we've discussed already, we get is what is deemed to be seen as a negative outcome, in the short term, the first 3 months, property prices may dip slightly. But beyond 3 months, property prices will start to rise again. Whether they started positively or negatively, after 3 months, once the dust is settled, we expect the market to start to kick on. Because finally, there's some certainty. We start to know what we're dealing with. Sentiment then will improve, as we've already talked about. Positivity is a huge driver of any property market. Banks will then know what they're working with. Lending will probably improve even further. Again, another driver in the property market. Those things and more combined means that we'll start the beginning of the next phase of the 18-year property cycle, which is the boom phase of the cycle, where we see more aggressive growth. So, first 3 months, I wouldn't really worry too much, but after that, we're fairly confident it's good times ahead.
You've said now is a good time to get a deal, but you've also said not many people are selling, so how do I find these deals?
Well, yes, excellent question. That is the fly in the ointment, really. If you can find someone who's selling, then chances are they'll take an offer. The trouble is finding people who are selling, and that lack of supply is what's spoiling the party, really. So it is going to be more difficult for you to find opportunities. If you've got your right move alerts set up, you'll probably find that they're pinging you less frequently than usual. You'll possibly also find properties being withdrawn from the market because they're not getting any interest because the buyers are all out of the market as well. So that is going to be the tricky bit. But if you do find one of those few people who are out there who are selling because they really need to sell, that is your opportunity. And that's where you really must follow up. Because just because there's all this uncertainty doesn't mean that they're automatically going to take a really, really low offer. They might do eventually, and the longer things go on for, the more likely that is, but they'll need to be warmed up for it. So if you're not doing this as part of your process already, when you do find something that's a potential opportunity, follow up every week after your offer's been rejected until you found out that it's sold. When there aren't many opportunities around, you have to make the best of the ones that are out there.
So how is this going to affect the 18-year property cycle? Or is this just the mid-cycle wobble?
It doesn't affect the 18-year property cycle. This is the 18-year property cycle. We are, as you've suggested, in the mid-cycle wobble right now. The timing is almost perfect. And yes, you could say, well, we didn't know Brexit was going to come along, but there's lots of major world events that come along and trigger the timings of the 18-year property cycle historically. There's always stuff going on that can move it up or down. But the timing is perfect. We are in the mid-cycle wobble, but we are about to leave it, as we've already discussed, and go into the boom part of the cycle.
Will this mean the mid-cycle wobble will last longer than expected?
Probably not, because as we've covered, even if the outcome is seen as a negative outcome, it is still at least an outcome. And the property market isn't like most other forms of investment, because a lot of the people transacting in it are buying and selling because they need to for personal reasons. So as soon as people feel like they can, they will start transacting again, and that's going to bring an end to this weird period. If the outcome's bad, it might still take a little bit longer. If the outcome is seen as good, then it will be over a lot more quickly.
What effect will this have on owner-occupiers?
So owner-occupiers are driven by sentiment far more than investors, or at least they should be. Investors should be a little bit more logical with their decisions. So owner-occupiers are going to want to feel safe and good about the prospects of the property market, and they'll wait till the market starts to improve or see signals that the market is starting to improve. And then as we move into the boom phase of the cycle, that good news compounds and more transactions will increase. So how does this kickstart? Well, once we have a decision of some sort, people will test the market again. People have been holding back listing their properties, and they will start to test the market and start to list their properties again to see what's achievable. People who actually want to sell but have been holding back, waiting for a decision. They'll be the first movers, and that will begin the process of owner-occupiers returning to the market. And I'd actually expect to see transactions starting to improve quite quickly after a decision is made.
How will newbie investors be affected?
I think newer investors are going to be largely in the same boat as owner-occupiers, in that they're probably going to be waiting around to have the confidence to make a move. We talked about Warren Buffett's famous quote the other week about being greedy when others are fearful, but that's a lot easier said than done. It's all very well having a pithy phrase, but actually having the confidence to make a move when all this negativity is around and everyone's telling you not to, it's not an easy thing to do. If you are a more experienced investor and you've been around the block a bit and you've seen it before, that becomes easier. Even if you're not that experienced, but you're making maybe your third purchase right about now, then it's still easier because at least there are fewer unknowns. You've been through the whole process before. If you're looking to make purchase number one, there are already so many barriers, and this is yet another one. So I think newer investors are probably holding off as well, probably waiting for the right time. And that's why now is the right time, because no one else believes it is.
How will Brexit affect the long-term property market?
This is a really interesting question, because as we've touched on a few times already, we expect the market to kick on. But the long-term economic prospects for the country, and therefore the performance of the property market, is very different. Long-term, everyone can have their own definition, but if you look at 10 years plus, what will Brexit do to the economy? It's really hard to say. You definitely have two very separate camps here, the optimists and the pessimists. Most economists feel that Brexit, long term, will have a negative impact on our economy. And based on the information available to me and with my limited economic knowledge, that seems to be the case. However, the base fundamentals for our property market are not going anywhere. We still have a supply and demand imbalance. And that, rightly or wrongly, just isn't going to be solved unless something very, very dramatic happens. And because the supply and demand controls the long-term trend of property price increases, whatever happens to our economy, whether you sit in the optimist camp or the pessimist camp, isn't changing. So we could go into a big, long rant and probably do a podcast on the future of the UK's economy and our views, and probably get it very wrong, but we could do that. But where our knowledge is strong is the property market. And what was true today is the same that was true 5 years ago, 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago and beyond. And what has stayed true is property prices increasing over the long term. Now, there's been many world events over the long term, and we have a presence bias where we always think what we're going through now is the most dramatic or the most important. It's not. In 20 years' time, they probably won't even talk about Brexit anymore. It'll be a footnote in our history. and hopefully an unimportant footnote. So world events are always going to happen. There'll be the next big thing in the future. And again, we'll question ourselves and the property market and say, oh, are things changing here? Is there a fundamental shift here? Will the property market now be transformed forever? The chances are no. But that boring consistency over the long term is one of the very attractive things about property investment.
What should I be doing next?
What should you do next? Do what you would be doing if none of this were an issue. Stick to your plan as much as you possibly can. Last week, we covered what would have happened if you'd paused for a couple of years and how you would have absolutely guaranteed losing yourself a fair bit of money. We also heard the previous week from a few hubbers who are just cracking on. They're doing their thing. They've not been deterred, and nor should you be. And it's all because of what Rob was just talking about. This is about the long term. If you're looking to property as a way for speculating on short-term price increases, then now is not a great time to be doing that. But then when is it? That's never a good idea. Property is best over the long term because of those fundamental forces that we talked about through Fundamentals February. When you've got that kind of time frame, it's so much easier to just stick to the plan and keep doing what you should be doing. And that's what you should do now. In some ways, you might be hindered because the stock that you're looking for isn't available because people aren't selling. In some ways, you'll be helped because there'll be less competition. There are people sitting out of the market. But the reason that we've been talking about fundamentals recently is because now, more than ever, it's important to keep focused on that and not get distracted by everything that's going on. And take advantage where you can, but broadly, set your goals, get a plan, and stick to it.
When can we all finally stop talking about Brexit?
Well, quite a few of you asked this. Some use more colourful language than others. But the point is that soon, hopefully. We've done a few podcasts on it recently, and we've really held back from talking about Brexit because it's such a divisive topic. However, hopefully we've shown you over the last few weeks that whatever events are happening in the background, you are in control. You, not world events, will determine whether you are successful or not. There's always external things going on, whether it's the government playing around with Brexit or things in your own life. There's always a reason not to progress. There's always a reason to stop and hold off. But that's you. That's your decision. It is also your decision if you push ahead, if you are progressing, if you are being successful. For those who are failing, in most circumstances, that's their fault. And for those who are succeeding, in most circumstances, that's their fault. You are in control of your destiny. Some of us are given more difficult hands than others, but ultimately, it's what you choose to do with those hands that will determine your success. And Brexit is no different. If you want this to be the event that ruins your financial future, it will be. If you want this to be the catalyst for your financial future happening and your goals being achieved, it will be. I think the big takeaway from all of this is ignore what's going on in the external. Deal with your own situation. You are the master of your destiny, not the papers, not Brexit, or not any other world event.
Okay, nearly the end of the show, but just time for Hub Extra, where we try to give you that little bit more, a tip that you can take away and use. And this week's Hub Extra resource is Monzo. Monzo, you might have heard of already. They've done a fair bit of advertising. They've got a lot of users now. And this is one of the new breed of online banks. There's a few of them around. Monzo is the one that I've used. And there are a couple of great things about it. The first way is how easy it is to open an account. Opening a bank account is normally a massive pain and involves a whole load of paperwork. With Monzo, you just download the app and do it from your phone. Really, really easy. The other great thing is every time that you make a transaction, you spend some money on your card, you get a little alert on your phone. It pops up and it confirms how much you've spent and even categorizes it for you based on the retailer that you spent at. And then you can go back at any time and look through your full transaction list. So this is really great for being conscious of how much you're spending. I don't personally budget, but I like to be aware of where my money's going. So this is a really nice, easy way of doing it. You could do it by going back through your online banking transaction history, but the fact that it's right there in the app and they categorize it for you, you can see how much money is going on different things. It makes it way easier to get a handle on what you're spending and see if there's anything you need to change. There are a few of these new style banks around. If you've got your own favorite, let us know. And it's brilliant that they are around because banking is definitely a sector that needs disrupting from a customer service point of view. But if you don't have a favourite already, Monzo is well worth checking out. That's at monzo.com.
So, as we said, we're Brexited out. No more Brexit topics. Next week, we're going back to our love property, and we're talking about city living. There's a huge shift here on how people are living their lives, and it's one that's not really been talked about much. So next week, Rob and I are really going to dig into the trend of city living and how investors can take advantage of that. So until next week, when we'll be back with the podcast, or in between Ask Rob and Rob, you take care of yourselves. Don't worry about Brexit. It'll all be over and done with soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.